How does SIBO testing and interpretation account for varying transit times among individuals? Could some people with slow transit times have false negatives within the 3 hours, and some with fast transit times have false positive? And how does taking a motility agent like Motegrity affect this? I think Dr. Siebecker says to skip the Motegrity the day before the test. Now, background. As background, my gastro says I'm normal with a rise in hydrogen of 28 over baseline at 120 minutes. Stating that
right, so that's not, to me, that's positive. That's not normal.
Yeah. Okay. Stating that the orocecal transit time is 100 minutes. The rise is only 4 over baseline at 90 minutes. So it's negative by the North American consensus. But according to Dr. Siebecker, I'm positive and I am taking Motegrity.
Right. So it's true. It is negative by North American breath test consensus. And this is why I don't like 90 minutes and why I don't use it. So even though Dr. Pimentel had a study where there was this one study he did where he found that 90 minutes gave the best like clinical accuracy for diagnosing SIBO. I have not seen that to be true in my clinical practice. And I have a lot of test examples that I teach in various classes on test interpretation that can exemplify this, where somebody wasn't positive by 90 minutes, but was positive at 120 minutes, sometimes even later, where, it isn't a black and white. See, this is my problem with this kind of test interpretation. It's not, I don't believe test interpretation for any test should be black and white by the numbers. We have, as practitioners, we have to use an art as well, which includes taking into account all kinds of things like your history and your symptoms, and everything should come into the interpretation, not just like a hard and fast rule on the page. And you have to understand all the mechanisms. And as you're saying, transit time, so you can make a good interpretation. So I have because North American breath test consensus only came in 2017. And I also want to tell you that that was really put forward for research because we have had a big problem that studies don't use the same interpretation. And so it's giving all these crazy numbers. And so they really just wanted everyone who's doing research to use this so we could get a consistency. So clinically, I don't think it's appropriate to go by that. So anyway, in terms of transit time, it absolutely can affect the tests. And so, as you said, yeah, you could potentially have a false positive. This has been the argument for a lot of critics for a long time. And you could also have a false negative if it goes too long. Now, I think generally, most people, we're going to see something if you have a 3-hour test that can let us know. So for example, for people who have like gastroparesis, I know gastroparesis, which is slow stomach emptying, can delay transit time by many, many hours. But what I've seen is that very often we'll get a double peak on a test, which shows the first peak is the SIBO, and the second peak is usually the large intestine bacteria. And you'll get those 2 peaks, but they'll be shifted. So for me, it's this way, right? In time. And so the first peak may come even after 120 minutes. But when you see a pattern like that, it means SIBO. It's clear. When there are 2 peaks, the first one is an overgrowth, an inappropriate overgrowth. And when it's shifted, it just means that the transit time is longer. So I'm letting you know these kinds of details to exemplify that, yes, somebody can have delayed transit and still have SIBO, and we can read that on a test if you understand how to interpret the patterns. So I would hope that your gastroenterologist is testing for 3 hours. I would hope that they would use art and not black and white science, and that they would look at patterns as well. And so I absolutely stand by my interpretation. Another thing is that just to make sense of it all, because it's so hard when you hear, one expert disagreeing with another, right? Or specialist, is that I was able to develop my way of interpreting tests long before the North American breath test consensus. And so that wasn't there when I began treating SIBO. And when I began doing these tests and interpreting them, there were a multitude of interpretation criteria. Every single lab that you ordered a breath test from had its own and different criteria. And every study I read used a different criteria. And so it was maddening. This was like back in 2010. And so I studied all that and I had them all down in front of me. And then I would look at all of that as I was interpreting tests. And then I would track the tests through as I was treating people, and everybody I saw had SIBO. And so, within a year, I could easily see what was real on the tests, really SIBO, because I knew how they responded and everything. And so that's how I was able to develop my belief that 120 minutes is correct. And also that I don't use a rise. That is the only thing that is different from my interpretation to the North American breath test consensus, just those two things.